Hello, my name is Anthony Horsch at Old Cowtown Museum. I'm the Director of Education and Interpretation. And today I want to tell you a little bit about the Munger family. Now, here at Old Cowtown Museum, we have the Munger House, which was a hotel and land office that basically is the turning point in Wichita becoming a town. But this was only 4 years out of the family's 45 years. And so I'd like to help to get to know them just a little bit better. So we start out with Darius Sales Munger, who, of course, is the husband. He was born in 1812, which I think is interesting because his father was fighting during the 1812 war. So most likely he might have been gone while his son was being born. His grandfather was a Minuteman and recognized by the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. And later on in Cowtown's history, the DAR purchases and provides to Old Cowtown Museum the Munger House. And so we're deeply indebted to have them, which is one reason why I wondered why they were part of that whole process because of the DAR background. Now, the Munger name is very old in New England era. Mr. Munger was the sixth generation. His first ancestor came in 1639, but his lineage does trace back to 1520 in England. Now, he was born in a little town called Nashville, and as you can see on the map, it's in the lower right-hand corner. Now, this is a little bit confusing. Darius's mother had 14 pregnancies. Of that, 11 survived, and Darius was the older of that group. So, a firstborn, we hear all sorts of characteristics about those who are firstborn people. So, the get up and go getter and that type of thing. And so Mr. Munger kind of fits that mold. So, what about his wife? Julia, also known as Juliet to the family, Phelps, born in 1814, which is 2 years after Munger was born, so she's a little bit younger. She was born in Westerfield, Massachusetts, which you can see by the map is not too far away from Springfield. Her father, James Felt, had a short life. He died at age 36 from the fever. And unfortunately, he has an unknown lineages. We cannot trace anything earlier than he, which seems a rather interesting mystery. Her mother was Ruth Stoughton, who lived to the ripe old age of 74. Her father fought in the Revolutionary War and also supplied the soldiers in that particular war as well. And he is also recognized by the DAR. So we have two strains that could possibly be enticing for that particular group. The lineage is traced back to 1413 in England, and her relative arrived in 1630 in the continent of America. Just like Darius, Julia has a family that had a number of siblings that died early in life. Of the remaining, she is the second out of three that did survive, and her mother had 7 pregnancies, which is not necessarily unusual in our era. So the first question that I'll ask whenever I was starting to look at these people is, how in the world did they meet? Now, you can see on the right-hand side of the map, Westerfield, which is where Julia was, and Forestville on the other end, which is where Darius eventually ends up. About 397 miles by the modern route, probably closer to 400 or so if you travel by wagon and the like. Of course, you remember back in our era, we didn't have things like superhighways and things like that. We did have a growing canal system, so there was that transportation as well as some overland routes. But how in the world would you meet 400 miles apart? So I would love to find the answer to that and learn more about their courtship and marriage. They did marry in 1834, August 7 in Forestville, mentioned that already. And you'll notice just above Forestville is the town of Silver Creek, where they will eventually end up living. August 16, 1835, their first daughter, Julia Helen Munger, was born in Silver Creek, right on the Lake Erie. Now, in 1835, the family moved to Chicago. Now, the first question that is asked is, why did they move? What was it that enticed them to go all the way to Chicago? Because it was no small feat. Most likely what they did, because they did not have as many overland roads as we did, is that they sailed by boat to Detroit. And from Detroit, they got on the Detroit-Chicago Road that went south of Lake Michigan and eventually wound up in Chicago. But as you can see on the map quest there, 502 miles by land. Imagine in our era, traveling 10 to 14 miles a day if you're going by wagon, 20, 25 if you're going by stagecoach. It would be a long, arduous journey. In 1837, they go to a little settlement called Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Chicago speculator Benjamin Jones purchased 2,000 acres and was hoping to put up a town. Was Munger solicited by this particular gentleman? Was there an advertisement in the Chicago paper inviting settlers to come? We really don't know all the mechanics of how that all happened. But we do know that on April 17, Munger and 40 other settlers arrived on the schooner Elwyn, and they worked to clear land and build cabins and start the settlement. Now, there was an advance crew that came and built a boarding house that they lived in, which of course was a welcome thing, I'm sure. Once the town was established, Mr. Munger became very active in the governance of that town. 1839, he becomes the road commissioner. He also becomes the constable, the tax collector, and you can see on the right from the Chicago newspaper an advertisement or an explanation of collection on unpaid taxes. In 1848, he becomes the justice of the peace. So you can see here the roots of what happens whenever he comes to Wichita. He becomes very active in local government here. While they're there, the Mungers have 3 more children. Julia does arrive pregnant, and her son, Charles Phelps Munger, was born in Manitowoc. He is celebrated as the first white child born there. Today, we might think that's a dubious distinction, but he was quite celebrated. About 40 years later, he returns to the town and they have a ticker parade, and he becomes a very celebrated person, speaking at many places and welcomed with open arms. We also have Melissa Love, born in 1840, and Amelia Munger in 1843. We'll meet Amelia much more later on as the family's life progresses. Now, Munger's obituary states that from 1848 to 1850, they lived in Ohio, but I was not able to find any kind of records as to where they went and what they did and how long they stayed and things like that. Just a complete blank. And so I'd love to find more information about that time that they spent in Ohio. It'd be so much nice to be able to find out where they lived, because the geography of moving from place to place is very interesting to me in our era. In 1850, they moved to Canton, Missouri, which is just on the other side of Illinois, and it's along the Mississippi. You can see by the map, Quincy is down below near Hannibal, Missouri, so that gives you a location. The census in 1850 lists Darius as being 37, Julia 36, and his occupation is carpenter. Now, being on the river like that, I'm sure there was lots of traffic and trade, and so there were many, many opportunities for on the steamboat lines that were coming up and down. Mary Ellen Munger was born. She's also known later as Molly, born in 1855. And that same year, Julia, their first child, at age 19, marries Enoch Richards in Lewis County, Missouri, there in Canton. Of that union, we have 3 children arrive: William, George, Sarah, and Melissa. And just as a side note, in about 1879 or so, mother Julia returns back to the area to visit the place where they had spent 10 years of their life. So would love to know more about what kind of life they were living there. Unfortunately, there wasn't a newspaper at the time, and there are very few records to go on. So now, from Canton, Missouri, in 1860, they moved to Topeka, Kansas. Now, one right away has to ask whether or not this was Civil War related. Were they Union sympathizers? Of course, Missouri was a slave state, and so did they move to escape that conflict? Do not know their motivation. The census lists Munger as a farmer and his son Charles at age 23 as a farm laborer. Now, while they are there, Melissa Munger, who was born in Manitowoc, marries Samuel Edwin Sweet, 29 years old. It was his second marriage. And of their union, we have 2 children that are created. Charles Munger has patriotic intentions, and so he joins the volunteer regiment out of Kansas in August 18 of 1862 and is part of the fight until the war's end. Whenever he returns, he marries a Mrs. Estella Ridgway, who this would have been her second marriage. And unfortunately, she dies in 1879. In 1872, they moved from Topeka to Orleans, Indiana, where they live until he dies. Of that union, there are 5 children. As mentioned earlier, she did die in 1879. He remarries a short time after that to Mrs. Mary Coakley, and of that we have 4 children. So 9 children are part of Charles Munger's family. So what is it that Mr. Munger did while he lived in Topeka? Lots and lots of anecdotal statements about him being a livery operator. And so I endeavored to try and find more about this livery stable that he was a part of. We have many documents that say that so-and-so and so-and-so is now working or living at the former Munger establishment. But the challenge is that we find that there were 2 other Mungers who were also involved in livery stable activity. Salmon Munger, 1860, has a brick and stone livery and very impressive. I was very fortunate to find that in 1865, his obituary, so we can now eliminate him as the source of these other people who are living in Mr. Munger or working out of Mr. Munger's stable. We also have an E.L. Munger who also have livery stables on Kansas Avenue, which is very close to 5th Street, which is where Munger's livery stable was supposed to exist. In May of 1866, in the newspaper, Mr. Munger wins several horse races in the county fair, and very, very pleased. In that same newspaper, there was an advertisement for a lost dog. And you'll notice at the very end, it says, please deliver to D.S. Munger at his livery stable. So we can now certify that in 1866, Dries Munger was operating a livery stable. And then soon after that, in the newspaper, we find a new advertisement for a new livery stable. And that ad runs from 1867 October to 1868 in February. So he is definitely a livery man. And so that is good news, confirms some of our other information. But a strange thing happened in February of 1868. Mr. Munger proposes a lottery, a drawing, a raffle, if you will, to dispose of his rolling stock as well as all of his livestock, valued at $2,498. $98? Anyways, what in the world is going on? He's got a brand new livery stable. He hasn't been in it quite a year yet. And here he is already getting out of the business. Makes one wonder. Makes one wonder whether or not he is visiting with J.R. Meade and whether or not he's visiting with Governor Crawford about this possible move to this Wichita to create a town. So it was a spur of the moment decision. Did they strike while the iron was hot? We really won't know, and have not been able to find any other information beyond what the newspaper lists. It says the drawing was postponed. It eventually happens. I believe it was toward the middle of the month. And so all of his goods are disposed of. So what is the opportunity? April 23rd, 1868, the Wichita Town and Land Company was created to create a town at the meeting of the Big and Little Arkansas River here in our part of the world. And Mr. Munger in May of 1868 was sent to select a site before any other people got there and claim it for the company and create a house and begin selling town plots so they can make lots of money. This is what they were hoping to do. The goal was to have 640 acres drawn into town lots that could be sold. They also wanted 320 acres in 5-acre plots for public land, churches, schools, and park. But the problem was this land was still officially owned by the Osage Nation. As often happened in our history, settlers would move into Native American land and occupy it with the idea that the government is going to eventually catch up and give them preemption rights. The only problem for Mr. Munger is, though, he is going to be trying to sell people town lots, and he does not have clear title to provide to them that says, yes, this is guaranteed to be your land. So that's a bit of a problem in their success. Munger very quickly sets to work on creating his log cabin hotel land office, primarily doing most of the work on his own and using local products. There were some things, of course, that he could not create, hardware, doors, hinges, nails, and things like that, window glass, flooring, and window sashes. All of those things he procured at the local lumber yard, which happened to be in Emporia, which is about a 5-day wagon ride there and about an 8-day wagon ride back. So if you've done some of those home improvement projects and you've gone to the hardware store 5 or 6 times, Mr. Munger had to have a very good list whenever he went. Now you notice from the picture, there's a bit of a canopy or something over part of the house. That is the kitchen section. And that was his tent roof that he lived in while he was building the house. He also spent a lot of time selling supplies out of the back of his wagon, kind of operating as a mercantile, much to the dismay of the other partners in the venture because they wanted him to get his building built and begin operation. Doesn't mean he wasn't already selling town plots as well, but he would have a more established business if he got that building created. Now, local materials. There was a small island where the Arkansas River, the big and the little Arkansas River meet. It no longer exists, but there were lots of cottonwood trees, as well as on each side of the river. Cottonwood is a native Kansas tree, and it grows very, very well in our part of the country. Whenever he got ready to put plaster on his walls, he created the lath out of small willow branches that he found along the river. Now, if you take a look at the section of the picture, think about how many lath pieces, branches he would have had just to fill up one wall. He spent an awful lot of time whittling those out. And then if you can see toward the middle of the picture, there's a little cut nail that is holding that lath in place. Now, what did he use for plaster himself? He was a very creative gentleman. He found freshwater mussels along the river. He picked up those shells, put them in a fire, and reduced them down to ash for the lime. He mixed it then with sand and the buffalo hair that was abundant in this particular part of the country because of all of the hunting. And that is what he used to create his plaster on his walls. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a little brown tuft, that's some buffalo hair. And at the very edge, on the top edge, you can see some other buffalo hair winging out of there. So it's pretty cool stuff. We do have this section of plaster up on the second floor. Haven't figured out a way to remove it intact so that we can make it accessible to the general public. So we do provide photographs of it instead. Now, Mary Ellen, Molly, as we have mentioned already, you'll notice I've got her spelled as Molly with a Y. Several different places list different forms of her name. She was in Topeka, finishing out at the Episcopal Female Seminary, basically a high school for girls. Most public schools did not hold high schools for girls beyond elementary school. And so you have to give some compliments to the Munger family that they invited their daughter to go to school past elementary school. And this was rather a rigorous place, lots of focus on the arts as well as the humanities. And so it was a very, very thorough education that she got at the age of 14. In March of 1869, she joined her father down at the building site. She helped him complete the second story, the roofs, the dormers, and things like that. We have lots of images of her clambering about on the roof in her Victorian dress because, of course, pants were frowned upon for girls in our era. So she was quite a bit of a tomboy. So that's most likely a true assessment of what was going on. By 1869, in September, the house is complete. Hooray! It is now available for Julia to come down and live. She brings her unattached daughter, Amelia, and they begin organizing and operating a 4-room hotel. Now let's review real quickly. 1869, Amelia and Julia come down. Where's the rest of the family? Well, Julia Richards is in Missouri with her family of 4. Charles Munger and his wife are expecting their first child in Topeka, so they have no desire to go. And Melissa Munger is in Topeka with her husband and her 2 children, which leaves just the 4 of them to come and operate this log cabin hotel. Now, this is a drawing, a pretty popular drawing of what the layout of the town at that particular point was. Toward the middle, you can see D.S. Munger's label as his house. A little bit up to the north and to the west, we've got Durfee's Ranch, which becomes part of it as well. This is a pretty rough and rowdy place. It is mostly men, not exactly the best place for some young Victorian women, but they seem to do all right. Very dusty and windy with Kansas, and it's very isolated. So not a whole real enticement for the life that they left in Topeka with all of its theaters and dances and things like that. So took a lot of determination to come and participate in this. So here we have Mr. Seward's drawing of what this particular era might have looked like. In the very forefront, you have Mr. Munger's house, have a blacksmith shop, Llewellyn's general store in the back. We have Mike Mayer's cabin. We have the Smith house. We have a saloon across the street from Mr. Munger's house. We have the Buckhorn Hotel. Now, of course, you're probably want to go stay at the Munger Hotel because, as you can tell, the Buckhorn Hotel has a sod roof, which is not watertight. Munger has a shingled roof. Buckhorn, I think, only had 2 rooms to let, whereas Munger had 4. At the very end of this look, we have the Presbyterian Church, which is just getting started. And way in the back to the left, we have Durfee's Trading Post that we will mention again. So 1870, the census reports Munger lists his occupation as farmer, which is very interesting because he's a land merchant as well as a hotel, operates a hotel. So why did he list his occupation as farmer? That's very, very puzzling. We also list Julia as 56 and Mary at 16. Now, in running the hotel, Molly basically helped Darius. He was a postmaster at the time, and she was also helping with odd jobs around the house. Amelia, age 25, helped Julia in the running of the hotel, did lots of shopping, domestic work, and things like that. But in 1870, right before the census is taken, Amelia marries William Sherman Austin of Wichita, and they eventually move to Indiana, New Albany, Indiana. And so to run the hotel, we now have just the 3 of them. Now, the Wichita Viaduct at that particular time was very, very complimentary of the building that they were and the resort that they were creating, a far pleasant resort. And it also says that host and hostess Munger will never do too much for the comfort of their guests. Success to theirs. But remember, all we have are the 3, and Darius was out selling land and things like that. So how involved in the operation of the hotel is probably doubtful. So it leaves it to Molly as well as Julia. In 1871, Munger adds 5 more rooms. All of a sudden, we have 7 rooms to rent, which means we have a capacity of 14 people on the narrow side versus the 8 people that we had before. So all of a sudden, the work of hoteling has doubled. Now, you'll notice that we get 3 meals a day plus good beds for $2. Now, 3 meals may sound like an interesting bargain for you folks listening, but in this era, we are not connected with the coal fields yet, and so they are burning wood or lots of buffalo chips. The food that they are getting may be from the local stores or else freighted in. They were known to have a constant simmering coffee pot, so they had to keep the fire going most of the time. And it also notes clean sheets. They, of course, were washed and ironed by hand. They did not have indoor plumbing, so water had to be carried in, heated on the stove, and carried back out and dumped whenever they were done with it. And there was no real reliable commercial soap. So most likely she was making a lot of her own soaps from the different recipes. So interesting idea. Look who's doing a lot of the work in this particular time. Very interesting as well. By May of 1872, Mrs. Munger decides that she would like to take a trip back east because there are people that she has not seen in 36 years. So, is she reacting to all the work that she's been doing? One never knows. Or maybe it was just the time of life. It's hard to say. She is gone for almost a year. The Eagle reports that he is going to pick them up in 1873 April. And it's a curious statement. It says in the middle that their daughter Molly also returned with them. Where did Molly go? And when did she go? I thought she was helping to run the hotel. Mr. Munger, early on in their separation, wrote, Mary has done or learned to do many things while your absence that she would not have learned had you been here yourself. She manages the affairs of the house with the greatest of ease. Give our love and kind regards to all, and accept some for yourself. Very nice way to end it. But looks like Mary has stepped up to the domestic tasks that are required. Now, about the house itself and the surroundings, later on, the building is purchased by Mr. Woodman. His daughter Ray wrote a book called Wichita that tells about the life about 1877, as well as her memories. And she talks a lot about how Munger and his wife were very, very busy in planting and developing their plot. They planted a vineyard, cherry, apricot, peach trees, lots of flowers that they grew. And so they must have had very, very busy days. She also states in one of her entries, who else in Wichita had peonies? Mrs. Munger loved peonies. But as a historian, the fact that they mentioned it means that very, very few people in town most likely had it. And they were representative of her mother's garden back home. She also planted tiger lilies, Star of Bethlehem, as well in her garden. Later on, after the Mungers have moved away, they are still growing and working on their landscaping. She had some flowers that grew through the slats in the fence, and Ray took some. And Mrs. Munger saw her and wrote a letter to her parents criticizing her behavior and demanding an apology, which is a very interesting thing to do because they're probably only about 20 blocks away. So it would have been very easy just to have walked to the house. But anyways, Ray did provide a formal apology in person, as she said, and her friends were at the end of the fence snickering at her the whole time. So, but it kind of gives you a sense of the propriety of Mrs. Munger as well as some of the things that she loves. We also note in 1872 the produce that Mr. Munger's garden is creating. Radishes, lettuce, onions gathered. Gooseberries is his latest endeavor. Prettiest, most enticing place in all the surroundings of the city is the elegant kept garden of the kind-hearted D.S. Munger. And so, now you also had to know that the newspaper is published by Mr. Murdoch, and he has kind of a two-edged sword. He, of course, is promoting his friend, complimenting him, but at the same time, his newspaper is kind of a public relations vehicle sent all over the country. And so he's telling all the world that Wichita has some wonderful land that you could use for growing crops. So we are not part of a desert. Later on, We have the pleasure of eating and smacking our lips over a couple of juicy peaches from the garden of our townsman D.S. Munger. These were produced in only a 3-year-old tree. So again, promoting Munger, but also promoting the town and the area. And in 1873, in November, we have a strange article that appears in the newspaper. Mr. Munger is now the proprietor of the Empire House. Now, it says that after a year's rest, which makes me wonder. So while Mrs. Munger was gone, did Molly and Mr. Munger decide to stop doing the hotel business? It's a curious thing. You'll also notice toward the end, one of the things that they advertise is neat, clean beds and plenty of wholesome, well-cooked food. So he's kind of duplicating in a larger venue. Now, the reason I'm curious about the length of time the Munger House was in operation was July 12, 1872. This was the last time an advertisement occurred for the Munger House. Now, just because an advertisement does not continue on doesn't necessarily mean that the business has ceased, but he has been a real consistent advertiser up until that point. So it does cause one to wonder. Now, in the February advertisement for the Empire House, a couple of things to note. One right off the top is $2 a day. So that seems to be his rate that he charged for the Munger House as well. And so must have been a popular fee, but it is now renovated and refurbished. But the big difference is not 7 rooms, but we now have 48 well furnished and every respect a first-class house. So do we think Mrs. Munger is continuing to do laundry? No. By this time, there are many, many, many laundries in Wichita. You may or may not know that Billy the kid's mother, Miss McCarty, also ran about 4 laundries. And so it was a very popular thing to do, given all the hard work that it was for ladies in this particular era. And of course, is she cooking for the people? Most likely not. There are lots of advertisements for help in the newspaper. In 1874, in July, we also have Mary Ellen Molly married, and she marries Granville Perry Watson, and they moved to Newton. So it is just the two of them running this new Empire Hotel. The Wichita Beacon is very complimentary of Mr. Munger and his activities. For a quiet home abroad, for mother meals, clean beds, and a general make yourself easy air pervading the entire house. So, very, very, very nice and pleasant place to stay. But again, what happened to the Munger House? In 1874, the Mungers sold their house to W.C. Woodman, Ray's father, who was the first banker in Wichita, and they moved to a small house on 2nd Street, just on Water Street. In all of my looking, I could not find company documents, articles of incorporation, as well as articles that ended it. We do know that Governor Crawford had other political ventures that he was engaged in. We know that several of the other particulars were interested in doing other things. And Mr. Meade, who we mentioned already, has joined forces with Dutch Bill Greifenstein. And so there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interest in this enterprise, and it doesn't seem to be making much money. One of the reasons that it's failing is the activity of Mr. Greifenstein, who we'll mention in just a couple of minutes. Also, Wichita has a very small population, but again, that old unresolved issue of the land ownership. Who actually owns the land is something that really was an albatross around their name. They did create and establish Wichita as the name of the town. So that's an important feature. Mr. Woodman, as a banker and entrepreneur, picks up the Munger House and moves it. You can see on the map, it's on the right-hand side. The earlier map that I showed you had the Munger House much, much closer to the river. And in our era, moving buildings was not an uncommon thing. There were quite a few pictures about people moving them around. It's quite an amazing thing to watch. I've participated in several modern house movings, and I can't imagine with block and tackle and pulling with donkeys what it would have been like. So anyways, Mr. Woodman makes some very interesting improvements, adds a bell tower in the middle as well as a wing off to the right there in the picture there. And so it becomes a very, very fine, fine mansion. Here on the museum grounds, our administration building is a replica of this particular building. And so you can get a sense of what it would have looked like in person. So, Dutch Bill, a consequential accident of history creates Wichita. Dutch Bill Greifenstein was trading in the Indian Territory. His wife was native, and so he had kind of an in with the population. Many of his competitors, other traders, were not happy about this, and so they accused him of selling guns as well as alcohol to the native population. They got the ear of General Philip Sheridan, and he believed them, and he told Greifenstein, get out of here in 24 hours or you will hang. So, not having much time to leave with more than just his head on top of his shoulders, he left all of his trade goods and behind. And as is often the case, he sued the US government for compensation for his $20,000 worth of goods that he left behind. He was successful in his suit because he was able to refute the charges against him. And the money that he got permitted him to buy a trading post on the Wichita Town and Land Company land. And then as he looked around, he saw an opportunity. Just directly south of Munger's occupation, we also have the river, and he purchased a large section of land, being that he was independently wealthy, and he starts giving away town plots. He entices merchants to come from Munger's area. He creates a cattle thoroughfare on Douglas Avenue. If you come to Wichita, you'll find that Douglas is about 3 times as large as any other street. The idea being that you could drive your cattle through the streets and the cowboys would see all of the different places they could spend their money. So he was very, very, very active in pursuing his idea. So at this time, we have 2 competing ideas of a town. We have Mr. Greifenstein's section as well as Darius Munger's section. The 2 decide that they will go ahead and join to make one single town site, which was probably very, very important, not to be an acrimonious thing that would not have helped the town grow. They do join at Central, and over time, some of the streets in Munger's section, Chisholm, Church, Court, and Texas, are renamed. But today, as you go down Central, you will notice that there is still Waco, Elm, Wichita, and Pine. Some of the streets don't go directly through, and some that do have different names on either side of the street. So that's kind of the legacy. October 1875, the Wichita Beacon. D.S. Munger opened out of the old Daly House for guests last Monday. Wait a minute. What happened to the Empire House? He was doing bang up business there. And by the turn of the year, by 1876, he has retired from the business. In 1876, that same year, whenever he retires, Melissa Munger gets married to David Williams of Wichita. Their union produces 3 children, and by 1900, they moved to Oklahoma. But wait a minute, didn't she have a family up in Topeka? So most likely a divorce occurred. And though I could find no evidence in the papers today, most marriages and divorces, actions of the court are public record and listed in most newspapers. In our era, only the more sensational ones occur. So, but the idea of divorce is a very controversial thing. Before the Victorian era, in the colonial era and before, women and children were considered part of the husband's property. They are the engines of the economy. They help him make his business run. And so the idea of divorce was just out of hand. During the Victorian era, though, we have the beginning of a new attitude toward children, especially creating something called childhood, a time where kids can be kids and they were not considered miniature adults. Also, women are gaining more and more rights and more abilities to act independently. But we also have the societal view that women by nature are best suited to nurture children. And so judges in this particular era are very challenged because do we look at the rights of father or do we look at the best interests of the child? Now, women who sued for custody had a couple of challenges. If they were charged with adultery or if they left their husbands without, in the opinion of a judge, a just cause, then they could be denied custody. So most likely what happened is that the children that Melissa had were given custody to her husband, who then remarries and has a number of other children as well. So interesting transition in the Victorian era. Now, as I mentioned before, Mr. Munger was a very busy man, active in local government. He was a justice in the peace in 1868 while he was part of the Town and Land Company. He was a postmaster as well, which is what Molly helped him with. He was elected coroner in 1877. He was elected a police judge in 1878. Other activities, he was an elections judge, oversaw the voting that happened. He was also very much a part of the school board. So he's a very active man. Now, just to give you a sample of the police judge work, Mr. Munger had a Judge Munger, excuse me, had a lively time in court on Tuesday. The calaboose had been chucked full the night before, and the violators of the city peace and good order were brought up before him to have meted out their just deserts. Among them were 2 soiled doves, Alice Welsh and something Batzil, who had a tent on the outside of the city limits and had fallen into the clutches of the law, as well as Mrs. Spencer, who was charged with profanity and disorderly conduct. The amount of fines collected were $50. So sounds like an enviable government job, I do believe. In December 5, 1879, Mr. Munger died about a year after he had been elected to the police judge. He was aged 67 years, 3 months, and 15 days. He had been in declining health. The Beacon wrote in October that he had an attack of vertigo. In November, he had paralysis on the left side, and then later he died. The beacon, the eagle, which rarely prints negative things about people, did note that he had suffered for quite a long time with a spinal affliction and that his bent form will sorely be missed. So he was most likely a stooped over gentleman. During the 3 months that he was in the dying process, he was cared for by his wife, loving hands of her whom 45 years ago God gave as his life companion. Because he was so well known and such a pioneer, his funeral was the largest in the city up to that time. 800 people attended, everyone from the councilman and the mayor, chief of police and fire, and many, 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 many other people that he had interacted with. And so it's a real testament to his character as well as his contributions with the city. 3 months after his death, Julia Helen Munger Richards returns to Wichita from Missouri, her husband having died in 1873. And I also note that in 1882, Darius's Munger's mother, Charlotte Dennis Munger, dies in Iowa at the age of 91, which is pretty much straight north of Wichita, although quite a bit of a distance. One also wonders whether or not the family kept in touch, whether or not they actually met each other. Most of Munger's relatives are on the East Coast or on the West Coast, surprisingly. And so to have someone so near seems like an opportunity that I hope he took advantage of. March 18, 1894, Julia Phelps Munger dies, 80 years and 89 days. She was a gentle, sweet mother, who most dutiful wife and sincere Christian, whose life equaled her profession. Now, I started this research project because in a couple of weeks we are going to have an event where we are going to be focusing on the women of Wichita, and I wanted to present my interpreters and the volunteers with some background information so that they could accurately portray Mrs. Munger. And I was quite frustrated in that I really did not get a sense of who she was, what her skills were, things along that line. In a lot of ways, she was just an ordinary woman, but an ordinary woman that provided the ability for other people, such as her husband, to go out and do the things in the world that he did. So it was truly a Victorian, she was truly a Victorian wife in that particular sense. But it would be nice to know more and more about her, should we be able to. So they do list her survivors. Julia Richards, again, living in Wichita. Melissa Williams in Dover, Oklahoma. Amelia Austin, still in New Albany. Charles Munger, still in Orleans, Indiana. And a very strange thing, Mary Ellen, they don't list her by her first name as they do the other ladies, but they call her Mrs. G.P. Watson, which seems a little bit puzzling. So anyways, we come to the end. I was quite sad to come to the end whenever I made this slide. It was just kind of like, I've spent the last 2 weeks with this family, and it's really sad to have it come to an end. So I hope you've enjoyed this little wander through the family's history, and I hope you have a better sense of the work that went into creating the town of Wichita and how that was just a subset of their entire work life. So thanks a lot for watching.